Okay, so hello once again. Welcome at the seminar of the Academy of Athens on praise and blame in ancient literature. Today, it's a great honor that we can host Professor Stephen Harrison from the University of Oxford. As we all know, Stephen Harrison is Professor of Latin Literature at the University of Oxford and Senior Research Fellow at Corpus Christi College, Oxford. Meanwhile, he has held and he's still holding various professorships or fellowships around the world, including Princeton Institute of Advanced Studies, Rome, Tel Aviv, Copenhagen, and various other places. His main research interests are, of course, in Latin literature and its reception, particularly Augustan poetry, including Horace, about whom we are going to listen today, the Roman novel, and Neo-Latin. His recent only publications include a commentary on Horace Odes 2, the monograph Victorian Horace Classics and Class, and the co-edited volumes Roman Receptions of Sappho, among others, and Simus Hini and the Classics. Now today, as I said before, we're actually hosting the first lecture of this year's seminar that concerns Latin literature, for a change, not Greek. Professor Harrison is going to speak about self-praise in Horace. So Professor Harrison, the floor is yours. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Evostopoli. And I would like to apologize for the technical difficulties with my home internet, which means that I wasn't able to come on at the proper time. Kalispera, Seolus, and here goes in English. So my topic is Horace's self-praise as poet. And I wanted to explore this subject in the context of recent research on the poetic career, how poets develop and how poets see themselves as developing over time. And my argument really is that Horace's self-praise as a poet for his poetry is really only found after the middle of his poetic career. And even then, it's ironic or humorous, and it consistently downplays his achievements, sometimes or often suggesting that they're not his or that they're shared with other people or with the muses in particular. In his final works, that's to say the second book of Epistles and the Ars Poetica, Horace even suggests that he's not a real poet, and he takes on the role of poetic tutor instead, again with irony and humor. But my overall argument really is that this modesty about himself fits Horace's general advocacy of moderation in life as a whole. So I'm going to begin with Odes 1.1, and I hope everyone has access to the handout, which you will need to follow this. So in the first poem of the collection of Odes 1 to 3, we find Horace presenting himself as a poet and a certain element of self-praise. I am a various people have careers. I have the career of poet. The ivy, I will read the English translations. The ivy pries of poetic brows unites me with the gods above, while the chill grove and the light-footed bands of the nymphs and satyrs separate me from the common people. If Euterpe does not hold back her pipes or Polyhymnia refuse to tune the lesbian lyre. But if you wish to insert me amongst the lyric poets, I will strike the stars with head uplifted. So here we have the idea of Horace ascending to the heaven, as it were, a kind of apotheosis. But in the end, there is humor and irony, because when he strikes the heaven, he strikes it with his head, sublimi vertice. So what we have is a painful collision. Ponokephalo, I think you say in Greek, he ends up with a headache. So And my general argument is that every time Horace engages in self-praise, there is also self-irony. There is the edge is always taken off. So here the muses are on board, Euterpe and Polyhymnia. So it's shared glory, and it's a glory which is humorous. Horace will strike his head against the heaven, the brazen heaven, the heaven made of bronze, as Prince Pindar had called it. And I think much the same thing happens in the my second poem, which is the last poem of Odes 220. Here again, we have Horace setting out to praise himself, it seems. Again, I will read the English translation. On no usual or slender wing will I be borne through the clear heaven as a biform bard, nor will I linger longer on earth, but superior to ill will, I will leave its cities behind. I, the issue of poor parents, I, whom you, beloved Maecenas, summoned to your house, will not die, or be constrained by the waters of the Styx. Already now skin patches are shrinking to toughness on my legs, roughness on my legs. I'm being changed into a white-winged one on top. And light feathers are growing on my fingers and shoulders. More celebrated than Icarus, son of Daedalus, I will visit the shores of the lowing Bosporus, and the African Syrtes as a singing bird, and the plains of the far north. I shall be known by the Colchians and by the Dacians who hide their fear of the Italian army, and the far distant Galonians. I shall be taught to the learned Spaniard and he who drinks the Rhone. So here we have a very strange metamorphosis into a bird, but the emphasis here is very much on its bizarreness and oddness and comic nature. He doesn't say, I become a great eagle or swan. He says, something strange seems to be happening to my legs. The skin is toughening and so on. And this pattern of high and low together is repeated in the poem. So I will be immortal, but there are elements of humor. So I come from a modest social background. I am the person that Maecenas just calls and he comes to dinner because Maecenas is much more important, but yet I am immortal. I am undergoing this very ugly and comic metamorphosis, but yet I am immortal. I shall be famous and more famous than Icarus. And here there, of course, is the play on Icarus's bad flying. Icarus famously crashed. Horace perhaps will not crash. And then the final immortality at the end of the poem, he says, the Colchian and the Dacian will need to study me. So when the Romans have conquered these outlying areas of the world, I will be on the syllabus. Now that is self-praise. I'm going to become a canonical poet. But notice how Noscent galeri discetiber, they're going to be made to learn him by heart. And that is not fun for them. And one is reminded of the great Lord Byron, a great hero in Greece, of course, who, when he first learnt Horace at school, did not enjoy it very much. Horace, whom I hated so, he says in Childe Harold, and talks about the drilled dull lesson. And I think that's the point that Horace is making here, that Roman conquests will mean that when I'm on the syllabus, I'm going to be boring to these enemies of Rome. I'm going to take Rome's revenge on them by making them memorize my poems. So you can see, I think, that we have this typical conjunction of self-praise, but also self-undermining. And even perhaps in the most famous of the poems of self-elevation in the Odes, and that's the end of Odes 330, the climax of the first three books of the Odes, which were issued as, of course, as a separate collection. Even here, in the famous Exegi Monumentum, we have the same combination of fame, but also a certain amount of self-deprecation as well. So we begin with this famous image: I have executed a monument more lasting than bronze and loftier than the royal rotting place of the pyramids. Now here there are two elements of possible irony, I think. First of all, Horace represents himself as a craftsman, an artisan, and in Roman society, that was not a very elevated status. Cicero famously says that craftsmen are illiberales, that they don't belong to the class of liberal gentlemen, if you like, in modern terms. So he describes himself as a handiworker, which is a fairly lowly status. And he says that the thing he has built is loftier than the pyramids. Yes, well, that's a pretty big claim of self-praise. But he describes the pyramids again in a rather ironic way. The royal rotting place of the pyramids, where he puns on situ and situ, as Terry Woodman, for example, has suggested. And the same pattern is repeated, I think, when we have the famous passage about I will be remembered as long as the priest climbs the Capitol with the silent virgin. I shall be said, I shall be recited where the violent Alphatus roars and where downers pour in water ruled over rustic peoples. So yes, I will last as long as Rome. That's a big claim. But my fame will be in the local area where I was born, in the southeast of Italy, the area of the Orpheus and the area ruled over by King Daunus. So on the one hand, we have the idea of eternal life, if you like, and on the other, we have the idea of local fame. I'm going to be famous, but only in my local area. So I think, again, you have this dual strategy of self-praise and self-irony. And I think you can see this at the end of the poem, where the glory is claimed not by Horace himself, but by the muse. He addresses Melpomene, here I think that the muse of lyric poetry, and says, "Take on the pride earned by my achievements, Melpomene, and crown my hair graciously with the Delphic bay." So there's a shared glory here, and the muse is taking it on, and it's the muse who is communicating it to Horace. The Delphic Bay. And this is seen as early as the ancient commentator Porphyrio. He says, claim for yourself the glory attained by the riches of my talent. So he's saying, it's not just me, it's you as well. So my thesis is that for each of these great moments in the odes, where Horace is talking about his own status, he is actually simultaneously praising himself and ironizing that praise. And I think this is a pretty consistent attitude which we find throughout the poems. So let us turn now to the epistles, because the epistles are less ambitious as a work than the odes, and more autobiographical, more anecdotal. And here we have Horace's version of his literary career from the end of the epistles, where he's trying to set out what his achievements have been, his self-praise in this context. I was the first and set my untrammeled steps in empty space. I did not tread with my foot the territory of others. The king bee, sure of himself, will lead the swarm. So he describes himself as a bee. So yes, it's a flying creature, a creature associated with poetry and the muses, but it's not very grand. A bee is small, a bee is short-lived, a bee is one of many, a bee is part of a large community. Individual bees die, but the community lives on, as Virgil famously tells us in the Georgics. So that's the first, I think, irony here, that he describes himself not as a great grand creature, but as the small bee, an image that he uses elsewhere of himself in Odes 4, for example. And then he sees his poetic achievement really as following others. So I was the first to show the iambics of Parastolatium following the measures and spirit of Archilochus, but not his topics and the words that harried Lycambes. So yes, there's a claim of primacy. I was the first, but I was the first to do what? I was the first to, in effect, translate Greek poetry for Italy, a certain type of Greek poetry, the Greek poetry of Archilochus. Here, this is a reference to the Epodes, of course. So it's a bit like Plautus saying, Plautus vortit barbare, that I'm just a translator, if you like. And even at the end of this passage, Juvat immoberata ferentem, it's a pleasure to me to transfer things untold before and to be read by the eyes and held in the hands of my countrymen. So what's the metaphor of ferentem here? Well, I think it's the idea of mercantile transfer, the idea of carrying goods. I'm an importer of goods. Again, not a very elevated role in Rome. To try and get this in some perspective, I wanted to compare Horace's statements about his poetic originality to those of Lucretius for the beginning of Book 4, the famous repeated passage, which I think really should stand both in Book 1 and in Book 4. And here we have a very grand statement of the poet's originality. I traverse the trackless regions of the Muses, untrodden by anyone's foot before. It is my pleasure to seek the springs and drink deep of them, to pluck new flowers and to seek a fine garland for my head from them, with which the Muses have covered no one's head before. First, because I teach about great matters and push ahead to free the spirit from the tight bonds of superstition. Second, because I compose poems of such clear light about a dark matter, sprinkling it all with the charm of the Muses. So here we have very much the same language, but used in a much grander way, and there's much more self-praise, repetition of the idea of being unprecedented, and self-praise in the matter of poetic texture, the charm of the Muses, and self-praise in the matter of illumination. I bring light to darkness. Lucretius, of course, has some grounds for self-praise here. It's pretty much certainly the first Epicurean hexameter poem in Latin, and indeed probably the last. But I think it's very clear that the tone is quite different. And Horace is reacting to Lucretius. One of the things that's going on in Book 1 of the Epistles is that it's a reading of Lucretius as the philosophical poet in Latin hexameters. Okay, now I want to talk about a slightly later period in Horace's poetic career, and this is after the Carmen Saeculare in 17. It's clear, I think, that the Carmen Saeculare is a watershed in Horace's career, and it's at that point that he achieves a certain amount of national fame, and that, as he says in one of his poems, in this poem, people point him out in the street. So he is a celebrity. This is not perhaps what he wanted, as we shall see, because he's not that kind of person. But here he talks about his status after the Carmen Saeculare. The issue of Rome, first of cities, chooses to set me among the charming bands of poets, and I am now less bitten by the tooth of envy. Muse, who harmonizes the sweet din of the golden tortoise shell, you who could give, if you wish, the song of the swan to speechless fish, it is all due to your gift that I am pointed out by the fingers of passers-by as the poet of the Roman lyre. That I breathe and please, if please I do, is your doing. So again, what's going on is that the poet is saying, it's not me, it's you, the muse. If I have distinction, if I have reputation, it is due to the muse and not to myself, or not so much to myself. So again, it's this strategy of saying, yes, I am a celebrity and I have a certain achievement in Rome, but this is not entirely my own doing. Now, one aspect of this celebrity status is that it's clear from the later poems of Horace that he is in a way forced to have a greater public profile. And in Epistles 2:2, which I certainly want to date later to the last period of Horace's life, to the period of 12 to 8, we find a kind of celebrity recitation war between Rome's greatest poets of this period. Remember that Virgil is dead by now, Tibullus is dead, Ovid is just starting. So the two poets who are top of the tree and still alive are, I think, Horace and Propertius. And this passage for me narrates a verbal battle between Horace and Propertius. And here he's talking about rivalry in general and giving us the example of rival poets, himself and Propertius. How can this kind of madness trouble shrill-voiced poets any less? I compose odes, he elegies, an oeuvre miraculous to behold and crafted by the 9 muses. See first with what disdain, with what intensity we look around the temple, now free for the poets of Rome. Next as well, if you are free, follow and hear at some distance what each has to offer and how he weaves his garland for himself. We are battered and each eat up our opponent with matching blows, Samnite gladiators in lingering warfare until the first oil lamps. I come off as Alcaeus on his marking, what of him on mine, who except Telemachus? So here we have the 2 greatest poets of the age performing in a very prestigious location, almost certainly the Temple of Palatine Apollo, just about the most prestigious location in Rome for poets, probably in the library which has been built for Roman poets for their works. So it's the location in which they are hoping to achieve canonical status. Literally, they're going to be put on the shelves. And yet the whole thing is satirized and told in an amusing way. So the context is Rome is full of people who express their rivalry in an aggressive way. And he's saying poets are not exempt from this. Poets are just as bad as everyone else. I compose odes, he compose elegies. And then we get this kind of literary journalism, an oeuvre miraculous to behold and crafted by the 9 muses. This is surely an ironic presentation of the usual kind of comment that people make. There's lots of satire about the pretensions of these 2 poets. With what intensity will you look around the temple, now free for the poets of Rome? And an idea that they're a kind of self-satisfied poets club. But when we get to the actual recitation, the kind of rap battle, if you like, the metaphor is one of war. They're like gladiatorial fighters. We are battered, we eat up our opponent with matching blows. Samnite gladiators in lingering warfare. Now, this is not a grand image. This is, again, an image from the lower levels of Roman society. Remember that gladiators are usually ex-criminal slaves, that they have very low social status, and that they count for very little in Rome. So to compare the 2 greatest poets of Rome to a pair of gladiators competing is not a compliment, it's an ironic deflation. And even though they come off with being the second Alcaeus and the second Callimachus. That must be a reference to Propertius, I'm sure. You can see that again, we have this self-praise on the one hand, the two greatest poets of Rome meeting in the greatest location, but also this lower note that they are like a pair of lowly gladiators, and they're just really behaving as badly as everyone else in wanting to fight and to be aggressive. So even when Horace is absolutely at the top of his career as the poet of the Carmen Saeculare, as the poet who is brought out to the place of honor in Rome, the temple of Apollo, he ironizes himself because that is, generally speaking, his approach. So those are my examples, and now I want to turn to what conclusions we can draw from this. So why is Horace reluctant to praise his own poetry without irony? Well, I think this is fully consistent with the persona that he presents throughout his work, in that he is consistently someone who is self-restrained and moderate in every way, whether it's in terms of his philosophical doctrine. As we see in the epistles, he is always recommending the middle way, the aurea mediocritas, as he calls it in the Odes. He recommends moderation in wealth. Yes, he has his Sabine estate, but he doesn't want to be a millionaire, as most of the Roman upper class either were or wished to be. He is moderate in matters of sex and love, and he is moderate, famously, in matters of food. When he has the dinner that he serves in Satires 2, it's a very moderate dinner. Vegetables are not the exotic food that you get at Maecenas' house, for example. So I think it's fully consistent with his self-presentation across all of his work. So why do we find more self-praise in the Odes, though, as I have argued, it's always offset or discounted or counterbalanced by a certain amount of self-irony? Well, I think this probably is to do with poetic genre. Lyric is a relatively elevated genre certainly compared to the iambic poetry of the Epodes, which, remember, iambic poetry in Greek is very low level in terms of its subject matter and its language, the famous pornographic fragments of Archilochus, for example. And lyric poetry is grander than the kind of Lucilian sermo, the colloquial hexameter poetry that Horace practices in the Satires and Epistles. So I think it goes with the territory, and perhaps it goes with the person who is behind the scenes, often in Horace's lyric, which is Pindar, because Pindar is always someone who is keen to praise himself. We don't see this so much in Sappho or Archias. That may be because they are so poorly preserved, but we certainly see it in Pindar. Pindar talks of himself as the eagle of Zeus, famously with the crows who are his opponents. So perhaps Horace is taking on something of this mantle of Pindaric self-praise, but he, with typical moderation, he ironizes it, and as we've seen, it's always juxtaposed with some element of self-deprecation. Why is it not really there in the Epodes and Satires? Well, there the poetic persona is much more moderate and less dignified. In the Epodes, of course, he is taking on the persona of Archilochus, and Hipponax, who describe themselves doing all sorts of low-class things in their fragments, particularly to do with alcohol and sex. So it's very difficult to give yourself real dignity in the iambic tradition. And again, in the tradition of the satires, the tradition of Lucilius's Sermo, once more, this is not a poetic tradition in which the poet presents himself as very grand. So I think it is, as well as being related to Horace's self-presentation over all his works, over the range of genres, it's also to do with each particular genre. Why is there less of it in the later stages of Horace's career, especially in Epistles 2 and the Ars Poetica? Well, I think this is again to do with genre. Partly we are back in the area of sermo. As I've argued elsewhere, Horace's poetic career describes a parabola, that it begins low, it gets high, and then it goes low again in terms of genre. So he begins with sermo, and with the ambos, we rise up to lyric, and then at the end of his career, we return to sermo again. But I think there's also, because at the end of his career, he has no need to make his career. He is the most famous poet in Rome, as he tells us in Odes 4, as we've just seen. So he doesn't praise himself so much because he doesn't need to. He doesn't need to in terms of the genre, but more importantly, he doesn't need to in terms of his status in Rome. And he is using that status to teach about poetry and to teach about literature. So it's not that he's denying that status, but he's channeling it in order to give his version of Roman literature. Now, is there some element of reaction to the literary self-promotion of others? Well, Lucretius, yes, I think that he is classing himself as a more moderate Lucretius. He makes very similar claims to Lucretius, but he presents them in a much more amusing and ironic and self-deprecating way. So yes, I would say if you compare those two passages, it's quite hard to think that they're not related. Cicero is an interesting one, and here I'm really thinking of Cicero's Brutus. So Cicero, towards the end of his career, writes his famous history of Roman oratory in the Brutus, which not coincidentally ends with himself, in effect, ends with himself as the climax of Roman oratory, pretty explicitly, I think. Now, Horace, in his Ars Poetica, and the literary epistles of Book 2, which I regard as his kind of literary testament, his view of Latin literature, he doesn't do that. In fact, he does the opposite. He says, I am no longer a poet, nil scribens ipsa. I'm no longer that poet that I used to be. But again, like he's doing the same thing as Cicero. He's providing his version of Roman literature with some famous judgments, like not liking Plautus, for example. But he is detaching it from the element of self-promotion, because self-promotion is not what he does, whereas of course it is what Cicero does all the time in almost every context. So I think there is a reaction to self-promotion here. And this leads me to my last point, which is really about how this can be related to Horace's general attitude to life. And I think here we can be fairly specific in terms of his philosophical views. In Epistles 1:18, he talks about the conflict between public and private life. What gives you untrammeled peace, honor, or sweet gain, or the hidden way and the path of the life that escapes notice? So what is the right way to live your life? Is it the public career seeking glory and wealth? Or is it the private life, the hidden private life of the Epicurean, really, secreta mater, phalantis semita vitae. This is the language of Epicureanism. So just as the Sabinum, the Horace's farm in the country, is better than Rome, pretty clear that's what he thinks in the epistles and the odes, so too the private life that goes with that location is better than the public life in the city. And the public life in the city involves his high reputation as a poet and the idea of self-praise, which I think he is never entirely happy with. So that is my presentation. I'm very sorry that it was delayed by technical factors. We're having problems in this part of the city with, I'm at home and the internet is dipping in and out. But I'm very honored to have this invitation to speak in Athens. It's a great pleasure, a great disappointment to me that I couldn't come in person, and I hope to rectify that on another occasion. So thank you all very much, and I really do apologize for the great delay. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephen. It was very, very nice that we could actually get to listen to you and record you. And we do hope, I do hope personally at least, that you will be able to join us in Athens sooner rather than later. Professor Synodinou, would you like to ask a question? I'm seeing you very ready. Yeah.
Yes,
Sure.
I would like. Well, I'm sorry, I didn't attend the lecture from the beginning. And so I didn't hear all your arguments. But even I'm not a Latinist, and I don't claim that I read Horace from morning to night, of course. But, well, just I have some questions, you know. And also, I must tell you that I am pro-irony, and I have written myself certain things from this point of view, especially for Euripides. But here I have some questions. In your fair example, you gave us some examples. Odes 1, 29, 36.
Sure.
The last two verses, can you hear me? You hear me? Can
Yes.
you hear me? Yes, yes. Actually, I read, and I can't see very much that we have a collision in the last verse. You know, I did hear your lecture from the beginning. Pharaoh, I feel it more that I go to the stars. Not that I will collide and I will break my neck, let's say. I mean, that's how I sense, that's how I feel it. That's how I feel the meaning of this of course, the lyric muses are source of inspiration, but this is a traditional thing, let's say, from Homer. The muse is always in the front. It's not the poet, actually. The poet is, let's say, the narrator to say what the muse say. And then the other odes, this mix metamorphosis, excuse me, just to see the text. Of course, Icarus, excuse me, I want to see the yes, this metamorphosis, this transformation to a bird, why is it ironic? I think that the Kyknos, the swan, is a bird which has associations with the poetry. I mean, you know, just I say my questions, perhaps they are naive, but and why is it ironic that the enemies of Rome will need to study Horace, let's say? This is the imperial ideology, let's say. And as Rome was taught by Greece, by the slave Greece, the same way the barbarians, the other barbarians will be taught by Horace, let's say. And what you know, I have some.
Can I reply?
Yeah,
but I have some more questions. Okay, I have some more questions.
Okay, afterwards, if we have time. Yeah. So, Professor Harrison, yeah.
Thank you very much for your questions. I think feriam really is a verb of physical striking. So it's one thing to say to go to the stars, iter ad astra. It's another thing to say strike the stars very literally. And I think it's hard for me to see it other than an actual collision, but we can differ on the interpretation if you like. Your second point about the mixed metaphor, yes, Horace, I suppose, is turning into a swan, but it's very interesting that the word swan is never used in the poem. We simply have to guess. And I think that's deliberate, that he's not claiming the traditional status of the swan, which goes back to Euripides and so on, and that he is giving us this very physical, again, it's the physicality, which for me is the humorous, ironic, the kind of physicality which is not at home in a grand context. So the symptoms of the metamorphosis are very low and humble and not very elevated, and I think that's what I think makes them comic. Finally, the idea that the enemies have to study Horace, I would admit that it's mixed, because on the one hand, yes, Horace is going to be part of the Roman Empire, and Roman culture will conquer these barbarians just as the Roman army has conquered them. So as you say, as Greece conquered Rome. But I can't get out of my head the idea that the discipline with which Rome is going to constrain these Barbari is learning by heart the poems of Horace. And I think that does bring back ideas of the Roman school where always had to learn, and they didn't like it either. Horace doesn't say that, but other people do. So I can see that it could be part of the Roman Empire, but I still want to hang on to the idea that actually it's part of their punishment. It's like it's discipline and punish. It's
like, let's say, the Christians went to Africa to Christianize and to make the people there politismen, like politicians.
Yes, thank you very much.
I have some more to say.
Professor Snodno, we are coming back to you after.
Yes, because the most important point is still to
we'll come back to you later. So, yes, Professor Titchener, please.
Hi, Stephen.
Hi, Fran. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you too. And I'm absolutely counting on you, Roman style, to have been draining any kind of bad luck away from me, so that when I'm on next week, I will have no connectivity problems. You have taken it all on. I'm particularly intrigued, and as compliment you, since as a non-Horatian, I was very intrigued and enjoyed very much hearing you talk. I especially like the idea of the city with a public and private presentation. As a Plutarchan, that's extraordinarily useful. And also the idea of a hierarchy of art form, since biography versus history, again, these resonate with me. But the reason I'm interceding here is to ask you specifically about handout 6 and a line in the middle. And again, I too came in late. And so if this was simply discussed already, I apologize. I'm looking 5 lines down to next as well. If you are free, follow and hear at some distance. And this just almost made me laugh out loud in terms of self-deprecation. First of all, I wonder about the si wakas. If you're free, part of my question is, does this nothing better to do?
Yes.
Second, here at some distance, is this some sort of joke about volume? And finally, it reminded me a great deal of the boar in terms of, on the one hand, I'm a very famous person. People follow me and try to attach themselves to me, and I cannot make them stop. And this reminded me a little bit. So at any rate, that's my question, is that, do you believe this really supports your statement, this little line in here?
Yes, I do. And thank you for that. So yes. So again, the contrast is between, as it were, the notionally prestigious nature of the occasion. The 2 greatest poets of Rome are participating, if you like, in a literary award ceremony, because that's what it comes down to, this kind of contest. But on the other hand, Horace is treating it in this humorous way. So this is the greatest literary event of the year. It's come along if you've got time, if you're free. And you could stand at some distance. So procul is a difficult word. Sometimes it means far away and sometimes it means close. And here I think it probably means at a little distance away. You can get up really close to these big people because actually they're not very impressive, and there won't be enormous numbers of people there, maybe. And the idea of weaving the garland for himself, of course, this uses the language that's been used by Renaissance scholars of the literary career. So self-crowned laureates, Patrick Cheney. And I think Horace is ironizing the pretensions of poets in this kind of prestigious environment. And actually, when they get down to it, it's just a fight. It's not a high literary occasion. It's a bruising encounter, because what he's concerned with is the ambition and the furor, the sort of psychic imbalance, which makes them so competitive. And he's just not interested. And in other parts of his work, he clearly isn't interested in recitation. He regards it as not something he wants to do. Essentially, he is a private poet who likes to live in the country and write his stuff. So yes, absolutely. I think that these are all elements which support my argument, I think. I think he's very consistent across this passage. So thank you for that.
Professor Christokopoulou, Silvana.
Hello, thank you.
Hi.
I am not a Latinist myself. I was just wondering whether there is some philosophical background when you refer to his contrast to the mainstream Roman habits, whether there are some Stoic, let's say, background which accounts for this attitude, for the fact that he lives by himself in outside the city and still presents himself as somebody who would be renowned. I mean, if there's some philosophical idea or
Yes, I think there is, and I think fundamentally it's Epicurean. He specifically describes himself elsewhere as Epicure de Grege Porcum, from Epicurus's herd. And I think this, I mean, people debate about the philosophical allegiance of Horace, and in the Epistles, he which is his most philosophical work. He presents himself as more or less Epicurean, but he's not uninterested in the theories of Plato and Aristotle and the Stoics, for example. Mm-hmm. But I think when it comes down to it, fundamentally, he is someone of Epicurean persuasion. And so I do think that his relative modesty about his own career is fundamentally linked with his philosophical views, that he is fundamentally Epicurean. I think this is one of the reasons why he just can't be too grand about himself, because Epicurus doesn't allow you to do that. I mean, there are complicated, also Epicurus did not approve of didn't approve of paideia, really, of high level literary education, which is a bit of a problem for Horace. But I think, yes, it is related to philosophical views. I think it's related to generally the philosophy of moderation, which can cover a whole lot of things, peripatetic, for example, aure mediocritas. But when it comes down to it, for me, he's an Epicurean, and that the need for the quiet life, as opposed to the life of celebrity, means that he doesn't want to claim celebrity for himself. And I agree with him. I don't want to be a celebrity. I want to have peace in my life. It's a good thing.
Mm-hmm. And what about a possible succession between him, Ovid, Lucretius, who were also considered to be Epicureans? Is there something into that they want to belong to a kind of diadoche, a succession of this kind?
That's very interesting. I think the relationship with Lucretius is interesting from that perspective, that yes, he wants to see himself as the heir of Lucretius, as the hexameter poet of ethics in Latin. That's very clear. But I think he is correcting him in terms of Lucretius's quite grand self-presentation, which many people have pointed out is not very Epicurean. Okay, so he's pointing out that the most famous Epicurean poet in this particular passage is not being very Epicurean. And there are a number of interesting points in Lucretius's poem, usually to do with poetic madness and poetic status, where he seems to move away from strict Epicurean teaching. So I think there is a dialogue there, and it's to do with what the proper view of Epicurus is about celebrity, really. Ovid, well, I'm actually one of the people who thinks that Horace is reacting to Ovid in his later poetry, in Odes 4, for example. And in Odes 4:1, I don't think you can see anything going on philosophically, but I think Horace is noticing that there's a new love poet who has arrived in Rome, but I'm not sure I can say more than that. Because Ovid did hear Horace recite. He tells us in Tristia 4:10 that he heard Horace read his poems, so they may have known each other, but it's hard to go beyond that. But I think certainly the reaction to Lucretius is there, definitely.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Other questions or comments?
Yes, so if anyone's watching this on the recording, I'm very happy to answer questions by email. I'm really sorry that been delayed.
With your permission, I'm going to send this recording to all registered.
Please do. Please do.
Online. There were about 60, okay?
Yes, that's fine.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yes, yes.
Okay, Professor Snodinu, would you like a last question?
I don't want to abuse the time, but well, this showed 3:30.
Yes.
Exec Monumentum. You upset my views about this poem. You say it is the last poem of this third book of the Odes. It is supposed to be the seal of these poems. And actually, why is it ironic? It is actually in accord with the building program of Augustus,
Yes, yes. You see, my
And it is, I mean, it is in harmony, in accord with the
Yeah.
imperial program. And I can't see actually how it can be ironic.
Well,
And then, yes.
thank you. Well, I think, see, my argument is not that it's 100% ironic, but that it juxtaposes irony and more conventional ideas. So the conventional idea is that I'm going to live forever as a poet, and that is an element of self-praise. And I will last as long as Rome lasts. And as you say, the idea of Roma Aeterna is, of course, a good Augustan idea. But then he doesn't say, I'm going to be known all over the Roman Empire like he does in Odes 220. He doesn't say, I'm going to be learned by Rome's enemies at the borders of the empire here. What he says is that people back home are going to know my poetry. The people who come from my Horus, from my hometown, they're going to read me. Well, that is not a world-dominating Roman imperial idea of Horace's status in the empire. So I wouldn't want to deny that Horace is in step with Augustus, both in this poem and in 220. It's just that when it comes to his self-praise, his self-elevation, there's always something which pulls it down, which makes it less impressive. So for me, it's not black and white, it's gray. So
it's gray. Okay, it's gray.
There's always some positive and some negative. So,
yes, and
so your reactions are perfectly allowable under my schema. You need to balance one thing with the other.
Last point, I don't want to abuse your time at the time. I think it is ironic when he talks about that he is going to untrodden paths, that he is the first, while he tells us all the time that he was the first to introduce Archilochus, to introduce Alcaeus, to introduce Sappho, and then at the same time he says that he goes to untrodden paths. And also we know that this notion of untrodden paths, of course, goes back to Callimachus. Callimachus was the first, I think, that talks about Apollo says to the poet that, well, the sacrifice animal must be fat, but the muse must be lean, and the poet has to go to narrow untrodden paths, even though it will be very narrow. This actually, I find that it is ironic.
Right, good, thank you. Yes, so the primacy, is a big claim. Then
primacy, the first in
big claim
in Roman literature.
Let's say. And it's a grand claim and a claim about status. But then, first to do what? First to translate something from Greek culture into Roman culture. Now, that's not the position of Callimachus. Callimachus regards himself as an innovator within his own culture who doesn't need the help of a second culture. So Horace, if you like, is standing for the cultural inferiority of Rome to Greece, that he's kind of admitting that. And he's saying, well, along with my fellow Roman poets, all I can do is follow the Greeks. So again, you get the primacy.
The primacy, but not the prototype, the originality. Well, thank you very much for your lecture. You upset me a lot.
That's what we're supposed to do. Yes.
I only have to go back to Horace, let's say, and to unlearn what I have learned many years ago.
Well,
thank you very much.
Thank you for your questions.
Silvana,
a very last comment. Well, I was wondering whether the second ode could be compared to Empedocles.
Yes, no, that's very
Yes.
interesting. Yes,
Okay.
because Empedocles, well, of course, Empedocles, like Lucretius, is someone who makes very large claims about himself, like uketithnetos, I am immortal. So in essence, he claims to be a living religious figure, an oracular figure who is not mortal. And it's those kind of claims that Horace is debunking. But I think he's using some of the same imagery. And it's very clear that Parmenides and Empedocles were circulating at Rome, because Lucretius obviously knows Empedocles very well. And I have no problems about Horace taking on the imagery about the poet that Empedocles uses. And I think he's doing precisely the same thing that he's doing with Lucretius, which is to ironize these very grand claims.
Exactly.
So yes, it's the same. And I think you can go through a number of
Exactly. Like
literary allusions like this, and the result is the same.
yes, and because there are some particular points, like what he says against madness, what he says about the oath by the water of the Styx. I mean, these are so Empedoclean that you cannot escape it. I mean, they are definitely, and yes, within the Ars Cursiva, so it's
Yeah, in the epistles, he talks specifically about Empedocles. I think it's in Epistles 1:12, which is actually about Sicily. So homeland.
Even so.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yes, so he certainly knew Empedocles, and I think he's doing much the same thing there. And in a larger version, I would want to take that on. But, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so if there are no other questions, let us thank Professor Harrison once again. Stephen, it was very nice getting to hear you, even in this way.
Yes, I'm.
And just wait for emails after the recording then with questions.
Yes, I'm very happy to do that. And I'm very sorry about the technology. But
it was fine. So
in the world of today.
So
thank you all very much.
See you in Athens
Bye.
sometime.
Goodbye to everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Oh.